passion has the power to consume souls, and few things in this world inflict as much pain as the shattering of illusions about a beloved person. Severing emotional bonds can be excruciatingly difficult, but delaying the process may lead to consequences far worse than a broken heart. Fate brought Maria Muñoz and Joel Pello together in their native Puerto Rico while she was studying nursing at university. Their encounter marked the beginning of a story that demonstrates just how dangerous complex love relationships can be if one fails to recognize the warning signs and take decisive action in time. Despite the fact that the man was 11 years her senior, they quickly found common ground and began building a relationship. Soon after, she moved to be with him in the United States. A few years into their marriage, the couple settled in Laredo, Texas, a city with a population of 250,000. Here, the young woman secured a position as a nurse anesthetist with a good salary. By that time, she already held a degree in the relevant field, as well as a certificate that allowed her to perform the duties of an anesthetist. Maria worked at the hospital alongside her husband. She was described as a woman who was extremely dedicated to her profession, attentive and hardworking. However, family always remained her top priority. After the birth of their children, she left her job to take on the role of a homemaker. She managed the household and raised the little ones. 31-year-old Maria Muñoz, in addition to being a caring mother, adored playing the piano. Once the children started school, she planned to continue pursuing music and renewing her nursing license. She was set to take exams to return to work at the hospital. The family's life followed its usual course, but this story would not have a happy ending. On September 22, 2020, an emergency call came through to 911. A man reported that his wife was showing no signs of life. He was clearly agitated and didn't know what to do. The distressed husband's name was Joel Pello, and the victim was Maria Muñoz. The man suggested that she might have taken some medications, leading to an overdose. At the time of the call, the woman wasn't breathing. The dispatcher advised the worried husband over the phone. He instructed him on how to provide first aid and perform artificial respiration on his wife. Joel repeated the process cycle after cycle, but to no avail. The first officer arrived at the scene within minutes. The press patrol and key events at the site of the tragedy were captured on the police officer's body camera. When he reached the doorstep, Joel opened the door very quickly. The man was wearing a blue surgical gown, which immediately caught the attention of the law enforcement officer. As soon as Joel saw the patrol officer, he hurriedly turned around and immediately headed upstairs to the second floor. The policeman followed him. Upstairs, the officer saw a woman showing no signs of life, with her husband performing artificial respiration on her. Maria was still warm at that point. Joel explained that he had already performed several cycles of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but it had failed to revive his wife. The patrol officer also tried to provide first aid, but nothing helped. The paramedics were on their way. During the resuscitation efforts, the police officer asked the victim's husband if she could have been taking any prohibited substances. Joel denied this, but claimed that she might have taken too high a dose of prescribed medications. After that, the man went to the bathroom and retrieved a packet of pills from the home medicine cabinet. He returned to the room and handed it to the officer. It was a prescription drug commonly prescribed for treating anxiety. Joel alleged that his wife had mental health issues. Lately, she had been depressed and was being treated for depression, but she hardly used the medications. In his opinion, 31-year-old Maria ultimately couldn't cope with her problems and might have taken a lethal dose of prescription drugs to end her life. However, the experienced police officer immediately suspected something odd in the husband's words. Usually in such cases, if a person attempts to voluntarily end their life by taking medications, the packaging is left next to the body. But neither on the bed nor in the room where the victim lay were there any syringes or pills. At the time of the police officer's arrival, the couple's 2 young children were still in their rooms, not asleep. The son and daughter had no idea that a tragedy was unfolding just on the other side of the wall. In response to the officer's questions about the children, the victim's husband said that she was a devoted mother. Alejandra and Valentina were 2.5 years old at the time. Their mother had taken them for a walk in the park the evening before the incident. Maria was in critical condition, and paramedics arrived at the scene and tried to resuscitate her along with the police officer. At that moment, the law enforcement officer recalled how he had tossed aside the packet of pills that Joel had brought. The officer did this to avoid getting distracted from helping the victim, but they were no longer there, which seemed strange. Later, upon reviewing his body camera footage, he saw Joel surreptitiously pick up the packet and hide it in his gown pocket. He was clearly trying to conceal something. When informed about this, the man reluctantly handed the pills over to the police. The detective took them to examine more closely and discovered that they indeed contained a potent prescription drug. The packet was almost full. If the woman had taken any pills, it was very few. 3 hours after the emergency call, the medics pronounced 31-year-old Maria Muñoz dead. Unfortunately, they were unable to save Maria. The detectives immediately spoke with her husband, who was behaving oddly, to ascertain the circumstances of what had happened. The man said that lately, there had been problems in their relationship, and they were living separately. That evening, he had come to his wife's place to talk about their relationship, hoping to sort things out. They had a calm conversation and seemed to discuss everything. After putting the children to bed, they were intimate. Then Joel went to take a shower. After bathing, he found his wife unconscious on the bed and called for help. Law enforcement officers closely observed the victim's husband to understand if he was telling the truth. The police officer noticed that the man was sweating profusely. He was wearing only a light gown, and it seemed he was completely drenched in sweat. This appeared suspicious. Such reactions could manifest due to the use of certain substances, and this alone gave grounds to suspect he was lying, which his body language also indicated. According to Joel, Maria was a rather modest and reserved woman who had issues with depression and anxiety. At the same time, she refused medical help, completely ignoring all attempts to send her to psychotherapy. Joel believed that she had reached a breaking point and decided to take her own life. The man claimed that prior to this, his wife had turned to the church, seeking solace in prayers, but it didn't help, and she wouldn't listen to him, refusing the assistance of a psychotherapist. In an attempt to find an outlet for her heavy thoughts, Maria started keeping a diary. Later, during a search of the house, the police found it, a place where she recorded all the thoughts that troubled her. She was afraid of losing her family and her husband, as well as harming her children through divorce, which she described in detail on the pages of her personal notes. It was evident that she deeply cherished her family. Could this have led to an attempt to voluntarily end her life by taking a lethal dose of medications, as her husband suggested? The pages of the diary provided a detailed account of the struggles she faced in the final period of her life. The detectives launched an investigation. Several versions were immediately considered at the scene, one of which was that Maria might have tried to commit suicide by taking a dangerous dose of drugs in the bathroom. Another possibility was that it could have been an accidental incident. Maria might have confused the dosage. The prospect of murder was also considered, given Joel's suspicious behavior. When the police asked to conduct a search of the house, the man flatly refused, claiming that he was a very private person and didn't want strangers in his home, rummaging through his belongings. The detectives explained that in any case, a search would have to be carried out to establish all the circumstances of what had occurred, but only later, once a warrant was obtained, and they urged him to allow it sooner. Eventually, the man agreed. While the house was being examined, the police, in conversation with the witness, became increasingly convinced that Joel was under the influence of substances. They then invited him to the station for a more detailed discussion. Here, the investigators ascertained that he was in an inadequate state. He couldn't stand up straight, sit still, was constantly sweating, and bumped into furniture when moving around. When left alone in the room, he cried, shouted, and hit the walls. The interrogation began around 4 a.m. The man claimed that he was the one who purchased the packet of medications prescribed to Maria by a doctor. The detectives tried to find out how many pills were in it initially to understand how many she had taken. But the man couldn't answer this question. It didn't seem strange, as few people count pills, but overall his answers were evasive. He appeared nervous and frightened. According to the man, he went to take a shower. When he returned, his wife was unresponsive. She was unconscious and not breathing. No more than 10 minutes had passed between these events, but the police had already ascertained that this drug couldn't have started acting so quickly, and moreover, couldn't have killed a healthy woman. Additionally, the police suspected the widower of lying for another reason. He claimed that he was taking a shower, which meant the bathroom should have been damp, with steam on the walls and moisture on the floor and in the bathtub itself. But none of this was found. Everything was completely dry. Even the towel that the man had supposedly used. He was clearly lying about taking a shower in the house. During the search, the detectives discovered a packet and a needle in different parts of the house, and it was the kind of thin needle used for intravenous drips. In the home medicine cabinet, they managed to find equipment for IV lines and other syringes, but Maria didn't use any medications that needed to be administered intravenously. She had only been prescribed pills. The detectives turned to the victim's loved ones for clarification. Maria's friend helped to shed light on why there was so much medical equipment in the deceased's house, which appeared highly suspicious. The friend and her husband had come to the victim's house as soon as they learned about what had happened. They wanted to take the children to their place for a while to look after them. The couple encountered the police during the search at the crime scene. Naturally, the officers wanted to speak with them. Joel Pello's odd behavior, combined with the suspicious findings in the house, increasingly convinced the investigators that the story about Maria's suicide seemed dubious. Too many facts contradicted this version. Maria's friend told the detectives that 2 years before the woman's tragic death, her husband had undergone drastic changes in his appearance and behavior. At first, Joel had rapidly lost weight, and then he began to build muscle mass, which raised suspicions about steroid use. Alongside these physical transformations, his emotional state and psyche also changed. Despite the image of a decent family man that Joel had carefully maintained for years, he now became more uninhibited and started flirting with other women. This transformation was reflected in his social media pages as well. Whereas previously, the man had exclusively posted family photos with his wife and children, now his profiles were filled with selfies showing off his new physique and boasting about his high earnings. Joel purchased an expensive sports car that had belonged to Maria and constantly bragged about it to his friends and colleagues. It seemed that family values had taken a back seat for him, giving way to egocentrism and a thirst for self-affirmation. The situation began to escalate in 2018, shortly after Maria gave birth to their second child. It was then that Joel became infatuated with a surgical ward nurse named Janet Aranda, with whom he worked at the same hospital as his wife. He later even took his mistress on a vacation to Europe, where they visited Spain, France, and Greece. During this trip, Maria discovered who her husband was actually traveling with. She had previously noticed Joel's close communication with Janet, but trusted her beloved. Now, her suspicions of infidelity were confirmed when she accidentally came across plane tickets bearing her rival's name. It was likely this disappointment in her husband that triggered Maria's prolonged depression. Doctors prescribed her antidepressants, but Maria rarely took them, fearing addiction and side effects. Instead, she tried to fight her inner torment on her own, increasingly confiding in her diary. In its pages, Maria wrote that for the sake of the children, she didn't want to break up the marriage, which had lasted over a decade. She was afraid that the little ones would grow up without a father, but the suffering she had to endure was unbearable. Maria spoke openly about all this with her husband, making it clear that she was ready to forgive the betrayal, if only he wouldn't leave the family. And it seemed to work, because a few months later, Joel confessed that he had ended the relationship with his mistress. To make amends, he arranged a luxurious getaway for his wife in Las Vegas, accompanied by expensive gifts. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a complete lie. In reality, Joel had no intention of ending his affair with Janet. In the end, as it transpired, the man had been cheating on Maria for over 2 years, right up until her tragic death. During a police interrogation, Joel admitted that their marriage was falling apart, and he was no longer living with his wife under the same roof. According to him, about 5 months ago, he had moved in with his mistress. Of course, the detectives decided to speak with Janet personally. Early in the morning, they called her and asked her to explain her relationship with the deceased's husband. The woman was informed that Maria had died just 8 hours earlier. However, the investigators emphasized that at present, it wasn't being treated as a murder case. They were simply gathering information to find out what had actually happened and to rule out implausible versions. At the same time, the detectives weren't rushing to conclusions, waiting for the autopsy results, which were expected to shed light on the causes of Maria's death. Janet arrived at the station for questioning. She confirmed that she had been seeing Joel for over 2 years. During this entire time, he had never once mentioned his wife's inclination toward any substances. Instead, the man shared with his mistress concerns about Maria's depressive state. The police hinted to Janet that the woman might not have died of natural causes, and certainly not from an overdose. They were considering this possibility and needed to rule it out. The investigators explained to the mistress that if Maria's husband was responsible for her death, Janet herself might be in danger. Obviously, they were trying to get the woman to talk this way. And it actually worked. Janet repeated that she had never heard Joel make any threats against his wife, plans to get rid of her, or offensive statements. Therefore, the mistress refused to believe the version about his involvement in Maria's death. Janet herself behaved calmly, had an alibi, and didn't seem like a person who could be involved in this case. So they decided to exclude her from the circle of suspects. Soon, the forensic experts completed their analysis. They found no traces of pills in the deceased's stomach, neither those she had taken before, nor any others. Although, if Maria had swallowed them while the widower was in the shower, as he claimed, the medication simply wouldn't have had time to dissolve completely in just 10 minutes. The cause of Maria's death was massive mixed intoxication. Naturally, the question arose as to how exactly she could have been poisoned. A careful examination of the deceased's hands provided important clues. It showed that Maria most likely did not die from an overdose of pills. A small puncture characteristic of an IV drip with a thin needle was found in the crook of her elbow. Blood analysis confirmed that Maria died as a result of the combined effects of several powerful drugs administered intravenously. However, the exact composition of this mixture remained unknown for now. The investigators decided to conduct a thorough toxicological examination that would accurately determine which substances led to Maria's death. However, the problem was the duration of this analysis. It would take a full 4 months to complete, so the detectives had to be patient. However, experts were already expressing serious doubts about the version of voluntary departure from life. After all, it would have been extremely inconvenient and difficult for Maria to administer the drug to herself in this way. Nevertheless, they couldn't completely rule out the possibility of suicide yet. According to those close to the deceased, despite all the family troubles, Maria found solace in her children. It seemed that they were the only barrier that kept her from taking a fatal step. It is known for certain that the woman did not have an addiction to psychoactive substances. This was confirmed by her relatives and closest friends. Moreover, no matter how carefully the detectives studied Maria's diary entries, they never came across any hints of an intention to end her life. She was indeed painfully experiencing family troubles, but she didn't give up. Faced with difficulties, Maria didn't try to escape from them in such a radical way. Instead, she was determined to overcome this difficult period. Investigators found notes made literally a few days before the tragedy. It seems Maria was finally disappointed in her husband when he moved in with his mistress. Maria wrote that she wanted to move on. She had decided to divorce Joel and start a new life. These facts only intensified the detectives' suspicions. It's unlikely that a person set on radical changes would voluntarily end their life. After all, now Maria needed to raise her children on her own, whom she simply could not leave to their fate. While the police were waiting for the results of the toxicological examination, everyone who loved Maria came to say goodbye to her at the funeral. Her husband didn't miss this sad event either. At the ceremony, Joel cried and looked extremely upset. However, to the deceased's relatives, his feelings seemed too exaggerated. Everyone knew very well that the couple had been living separately recently. Moreover, Joel was building a serious relationship with another woman. So when he cried over Maria's coffin and kissed her, demonstrating suffering and grief, the deceased's friend couldn't stand it and accused him of insincerity. But despite the widower's behavior, the detectives' enthusiasm didn't wane. They were already considering this case as a murder. Given all the circumstances, Joel remained the main suspect. The investigators remembered how he tried to hide the package with pills and only later reluctantly handed it over to the police. However, experts conclusively proved that this drug was not the cause of Maria's death. The needle found on the stairs and medical equipment in the house also aroused suspicion, but this evidence was not enough to bring formal charges. Even forensic experts couldn't say exactly how Maria died. To get more information, the detectives decided to have a thorough conversation with the deceased's friends. They still couldn't prove who exactly made that fatal injection. However, in conversations with Maria's friends, the police learned interesting details. It turns out that on the Saturday before her death, the woman had another argument with Joel. Maria didn't want to let him into the house and told her husband to finally decide, her or Janet. He chose his mistress. After this, Maria became angry, left the house, got into the car, and said she would file for divorce. In response, Joel became terribly angry. He hit the windshield of the car and broke it. It seems he didn't want to hear about divorce. On Sunday morning, Maria wrote to her husband that she was looking for a lawyer to arrange the divorce. However, Joel replied that they could agree on their own. He justified this by saying that lawyers' services are very expensive, and the process would take a long time. Therefore, it would be simpler if they discussed everything face-to-face, without outsiders. The couple agreed to meet on Monday evening. Before Joel's arrival, Maria sent a message to her friend asking her to pray for her. Maria was worried about how the conversation would go, but didn't feel any danger. She had no idea that this text message would be the last in her life. Early Tuesday morning, doctors pronounced Maria dead. And finally, after 4 months of painstaking work by laboratory technicians, the results of the full toxicological examination arrived. Experts found 7 powerful drugs in the victim's blood, including marine, propol, chitterin, and lidoin. This cocktail proved fatal. Most of the substances found are used during surgical operations and need to be administered intravenously. Maria didn't have access to such medicines, but her husband did. Law enforcement believed that this information would be sufficient grounds to charge Joel with murder. In less than an hour, the man was arrested. The police put handcuffs on him when he was spending the evening with his mistress. Joel didn't resist. At the station, he refused to testify and immediately demanded a lawyer. According to the prosecutor, the suspect personally prepared a deadly cocktail for his wife and administered it intravenously. The moment when the victim received that fatal injection raised the most questions. After all, the detectives had no direct evidence that this happened forcibly or through deception. Joel's former boss helped the detectives figure out the medications. He carefully studied the list of substances found in the victim's blood. But what surprised him most was the presence of a drug called propofol. This drug is not available without a prescription and is extremely dangerous in case of overdose. The problem is that if you don't monitor the person at this time, they may simply stop breathing. Joel's former boss was shocked, as the level of propofol in the deceased's blood turned out to be the highest in all his many years of practice as an anesthesiologist. According to him, such an amount could have been enough for several serious operations. The dose was many times higher than lethal. It seems the killer was acting for sure. Having obtained this data, the police suggested that Janet knew much more than she had told during the first interrogation. So they approached her again. The mistress agreed to come to the station for another conversation with the investigators. Law enforcement obtained a warrant to search her home, but found nothing suspicious there. No needles, no medicines. After this, Janet was offered a deal. She was promised immunity from prosecution in exchange for all the information she had against Joel. The woman agreed to this proposal and agreed to talk to detectives in the presence of lawyers. This time, Janet confessed that Joel had repeatedly brought medications to her home that he took from work. He used some of them for his own consumption. The mistress listed several drugs, and 6 of them turned out to be the same ones found in Maria's blood. After a short pause, Janet added that shortly before his wife's death, Joel had brought propofol to her. Given these admissions, the prosecution finally obtained the necessary information for the court. Pending the trial, Joel was released on bail. But later he was detained again to be charged with falsifying evidence. However, the man was released on bail for the second time and remained under house arrest until the start of the trial, which began in March 2023. The prosecution called 12 witnesses. All these people were needed to prove the defendant's guilt. In the absence of direct evidence, prosecutors set themselves a difficult task to convince the jury that the drugs were selected specifically for Maria's murder. The prosecutors were convinced that this was not a tragic coincidence, but a carefully planned execution. The deceased's friends claimed that the couple's relationship had noticeably deteriorated just 2 months before her death. They said that the husband resorted to physical violence. He also had a significant motive for the crime. After all, in the case of divorce, the wife could claim a significant part of the property jointly acquired in marriage. Joel was facing considerable alimony and severance payments amounting to about $1 million. As evidence, prosecutors referred to the victim's diaries. In addition, an important video recording made 4 months before her death was found on Maria's mobile phone. In it, Maria was talking to her husband in the car, trying to calm him down and save the family. But Joel reacted inadequately. This made it possible to understand how he treated his wife. But in this whole story, one main question remained. How did the defendant manage to force Maria to make a lethal injection? The prosecution suggested that he had slipped a powerful sedative into her coffee. The concentration was high enough for the victim to become more compliant. Probably Maria felt unwell, and then her husband offered to help by administering medication intravenously. Despite the breakup, Maria trusted him. Combined with the effect of the sedative, this led to her stretching out her arm and allowing herself to be injected. Each of the components of the fatal cocktail separately in such a concentration could cause loss of consciousness. The woman simply could not resist, and all together they killed her. Regardless of exactly how it happened, Joel's actions gave grounds to accuse him of premeditated murder. After all, he clearly prepared a mixture of dangerous ingredients in advance. However, all this was still based on circumstantial evidence, if not for the confession of the mistress, who became the main prosecution witness. Janet said that before leaving for the meeting with his wife that day, Joel said he was going to give her an injection. He allegedly had no intention of killing Maria, but simply wanted to calm her down. The woman believed that in this way, the man was trying to convince his wife not to demand 2 large payments in the divorce. Of course, this sounded unconvincing. Therefore, prosecutors called this testimony direct evidence of Joel's involvement in Maria's death. Also, according to the prosecution, the defendant did not immediately call an ambulance, but delayed for some time. He deliberately waited until it would be impossible to help his wife. Naturally, during this time he managed to get rid of the syringe with which he made the injection. All this was aimed at confusing the investigation. And it might have worked if the criminal had been a little more attentive and hadn't left so many traces behind. During the trial, Joel admitted that he had given his wife an injection, but he insisted that he was only trying to calm her down because she was behaving inadequately. The lawyers supported this version, arguing that the victim had been suffering from depression for a long time, drinking and abusing pills, at least for a few months before the tragedy. According to the defenders, Maria had swallowed too large a dose of medications prescribed by doctors. When her husband realized this, he decided to administer drugs that remove the effect of opiates, but he mistakenly injected propofol, which has the opposite effect and enhances the effect of narcotic substances. Joel himself was not aware of this. So, according to the defense version, Maria became a victim of fatal coincidence, not malicious intent. However, the amount of the drug was troubling in this case. Its dosage was too high. Besides, this didn't explain how other substances ended up in the blood. The lawyers insisted that Maria could have voluntarily taken her own life, allegedly against the background of problems in marriage. However, this version was completely rejected. After all, Diary entries proved that Maria was going to start life anew, not wanting to end it. And no signs of addiction, which the widower claimed, were found in the deceased. After 8 days of hearings, on March 30th, 2023, the jury went to deliberate. In less than an hour, they found 45-year-old Joel Pello guilty of the premeditated murder of Maria Muñoz, as well as falsifying evidence. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder plus 10 years for concealing traces of the crime. The man will receive the right to parole only in 2053. The victim's friend confessed that Maria sincerely loved her husband, and this was the only reason why everything went so far. He simply betrayed her, and then decided to deprive her of everything, including her life. This chilling story became another reminder of the terrible acts people are capable of for their own benefit and selfish desires. It showed how easy it is to ruin and even end someone's life while pretending to have good intentions. Unfortunately, neither love, nor trust, nor shared children prevented the brutal murder. Joel coldly planned and implemented his insidious plan without thinking about his wife's feelings and suffering. He made his choice, and now he will have to pay for it. If you found this story interesting, then subscribe to the Detective Brooks channel, where you'll find many more chilling stories.